Good afternoon. I'm Bill Bellinger, Chair of the Baylor Religion Department, and it is my privilege to welcome you this afternoon to the 2013 Baylor Symposium on Faith and Culture and to this plenary panel. Our format this afternoon is that we will hear the two presentations and then we will have conversation about them. And so I invite you to make a note, a mental note or a written note, or a note on the screen about the questions you might like to ask when we get to that point. Our first presenter today is Jennifer Herdt, the Gilbert L. Stark Professor of Christian Ethics and Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at Yale Divinity School. Professor Herdt has also taught at the University of Notre Dame and New College of the University of South Florida. She holds degrees from Oberlin and Princeton and has written the volumes Religion and Faction in Hume's Moral Philosophy and Putting on Virtue. The title of her presentation this afternoon is Secrecy, Corruption, and the Exchange of Reasons. Malesic meets Haidt and Yoder. Professor Herdt.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here at Baylor and to be part of this Kierkegaard conference. I have to admit that I feel very much as though I don't belong up here. And it's the man who's sharing the stage with me this afternoon who's responsible for my presence at this, because he happens to be one of very few people who knows that as an undergraduate, I spent quite a bit of time with Kierkegaard and wrote a thesis which even fewer people have read, and he actually has. So it's his fault. But I do think that one of the really interesting things about this conference is the fact that although it's very definitely a Kierkegaard conference, it's also a conference that has incorporated a number of speakers who don't usually spend their scholarly lives focused on this thinker. So it really is opening up Kierkegaard in important ways. So I'm very glad to be part of that this afternoon. In his 1943 introduction to Attack on Christendom, Walter Lowery made what I find to be a rather startling comment. In light of Kierkegaard's sustained critique of Christendom in Denmark, he writes that, quote, SK's contemporaries were disposed to conjecture that if SK had lived longer, he must have felt compelled to take refuge in the Church of Rome. Lowery is himself disposed to say that Kierkegaard may have been essentially a Catholic in his way of thinking. And in order to ground this conclusion, he points to the fact that Kierkegaard made approving comments about the monastic tradition, that he insisted on the imitation of Christ, and that he emphasized works rather than faith alone. Apart from the references to monasticism, it seems in retrospect odd that Lowery did not invoke the Radical Reformation rather than Catholicism here. And in 1968, Bernard Eller was to take up that banner enthusiastically in Kierkegaard and radical discipleship. Still, in Kierkegaard, we lack the typical Radical Reformation emphasis on the visible church as a contrast community. The church-world divide is played out in the alienated and persecuted individual. Kierkegaard doesn't tell us what form the state ought to take in order for genuine Christianity to be possible, although it's clear that established Christianity is a problem in his eyes. To look for a cozy relationship between church and state has a corrupting effect on Christianity. This is because Christianity runs counter to publicly recognized values rather than being supported by them. Christianity is always, he tells us, thus properly a form of martyrdom. Established Christianity has given way to these publicly recognized values. It is thus a mere simulacrum of the genuine passion of Christian faith. Genuine New Testament Christianity is misunderstood and martyred Christianity. This is not the whole story, of course, because Christians can also appear as bourgeois citizens. Their suffering can be hidden. They can be apparently fully at home in the world, having utterly resigned it and received it back again. Their relationship to the universal, to the society in which they live and its ethical demands is now mediated by the particular, by the individual-God relation, the hidden inwardness of faith, not by citizenship within a Christian nation. So while Christendom has a potentially corrupting effect on Christian faith, it is certainly possible to be a Christian even within Christendom. And in some sense, the form of relationship between church and state is always irrelevant to Christian faith. It can neither bring faith about nor prevent the possibility of faith. Faith is radically hidden, radically non-political. There is no sense in which, for Kierkegaard, the church is an alternate polis. Christians are not, for Kierkegaard, truly citizens at all, but lovers caught up in a passionate affair with God that remains radically private, even as it overflows into love of neighbor. So what are we to say about Kierkegaard and political theology? And I should pause to say that at least when this got started, this was to be a panel on Kierkegaard and political theology. I don't know if it's really ended up being that or not. It shrank to 2 people instead of 3 and so on. But so what are we to say about Kierkegaard and political theology? It might seem that we can make rather short work of this session. Happily, though, a recent book, Secret Faith in the Public Square by Jonathan Malesic, gives us plenty to talk about. Malesic's book is not about Kierkegaard, although Kierkegaard serves as one of its chief sources of inspiration. It's about secrecy. He argues that Christians in many regions of the US, as well as many other places around the world, still, for many intents and purposes, inhabit Christendom. Their public declarations of Christian identity are ways to make friends and influence people to garner social capital. He notes how important it is for American politicians to be Christians, preferably of some garden variety. And in the business world as well, advertising one's faith can be an avenue for inspiring trust. Malesic argues that this should be cause for concern. It undermines the integrity of Christian faith, rendering it likely that many declarations of faith and exhibitions of Christian commitment are hypocritical. Now, one might argue that the integrity of any form of practical or theoretical commitment is endangered if it becomes a ticket to success, since incentives will exist to adopt that form of life apart from one's own conviction of its goodness and truth. But Malesic's argument goes further. There's something about Christianity in particular that is endangered when it becomes an avenue to power and influence. Can Christians, he asks, be witnesses to the hard truths of the gospel in a land where being Christian is a form of political or social capital? And it's here that we think irresistibly of Kierkegaard and his attack on Christendom. A form of identity that of its own proper nature elicits suspicion, hatred, and persecution, that subjects its bearers to martyrdom, cannot remain itself and become a badge of respectability, let alone a source of status. And indeed, Kierkegaard, together with Cyril of Jerusalem and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, are the sources that Malesic turns to within the tradition, not simply for reinforcement of his diagnosis, but also of its therapy, secrecy. Christians, advises Malesic, ought to conceal their identity in public so as to ensure that they cannot benefit from that identity. Only then, he suggests, can they be sure that their faith is genuine. Knowing that this will come as a surprising suggestion, he argues that Christians should, after all, hide their light under a bushel. The problem, he tells us, quote, is not that Christians might bother others with the light from their lamp, and so they should keep their light hidden. The problem is that too often in American public life, the light is used to illuminate the Christians themselves, bringing glory to precisely the wrong person, end quote. For this reason, Christian faith should be shrouded in secrecy. Christendom itself has become the locus for Augustine's glittering vices. Christians are allowing the glory of Christian faith to reflect on themselves rather than ensuring that any glory they receive is referred on to God. These are important observations. It can be difficult for academics who inhabit a highly distinctive subculture in which Christian faith often elicits distrust or ridicule to appreciate that public declarations of Christian identity in this country have, generally speaking, absolutely no whiff of martyrdom clinging to them. But Malesic's concerns ring true. In the US, a public Christian identity is a badge of respectability. Still, I will argue that while the problem is a real one, secrecy is not the solution. To see this, we need to appreciate just how prone we human beings are to rationalization and cognitive bias. Moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt has memorably summed up decades of research on the relationship between moral emotions and moral reasoning with the image of the elephant and the rider. For the most part, the elephant runs the show, evaluating the potential threats and benefits of a situation in a flash and responding swiftly and intuitively. The rider is exceedingly good at fabricating rationalizations, that is, with devising justifications after the fact for the elephant's responses. While we might hope that the rider seeks the truth and the elephant can at least be trained to follow obediently, the research does not support this rosy rationalist picture. The rider, at least when it comes to the social rather than the physical world, is primarily concerned with appearances and reputation. Quote, "We act like intuitive politicians striving to maintain appealing moral identities in front of our multiple constituencies," end quote. If this is the case, then it seems wise to approach the reasons that we and others give with a healthy dose of suspicion. Malesic's argument appropriates this hermeneutic of suspicion and offers concealment as a cure. And this might seem reasonable. If we conceal our actions, we no longer have an audience for them. And thus there is no need to be concerned about what that audience thinks about us and our actions. We are freed to perform spontaneous works of love and mercy. However, Malesic does not really mean that Christians are to conceal their works of love in any simple sense. It is not the works per se, but the fact that the one doing them is Christian that he suggests ought to be concealed. Moreover, even if an action or its distinctive Christian meaning or motivation is concealed from others, the agent is still performing for multiple constituencies, for oneself, of course, and for God. We seek to justify our actions and reactions to ourselves as well as to others, so the hermeneutic of suspicion seems to cut deeper. And Malesic does as well. Theologians, he remarks, know how easy it is to deceive oneself about one's true motivations for any apparently good action. The hermeneutic of suspicion recognizes that the distance between one's overt and covert motivations is often great, and so this interpretive strategy seeks to uncover unflattering reasons for actions in the public sphere. He goes on, the suspicious interpreter acknowledges that layers of rationalization and repression often allow us to convince ourselves and others that we are perfectly virtuous, end quote. So it's not simply that we are good at devising rationalizations for our actions, but that we are experts at convincing not just others, but ourselves. People can, for instance, be hypnotized to feel a flash of disgust whenever they hear a certain word. When they are brought out of the trance to read a story containing that word, they will not simply feel the flash of disgust, but also condemn morally anyone closely associated with that word in the story. So, hypnotized to feel disgust at the word take, subjects who heard a story about a congressman who, quote, takes bribes from the tobacco lobby, were more condemning of the congressman than those who heard a story about a congressman who, quote, is often bribed by the tobacco lobby. No take in there. Much more remarkably, they were also condemning of Dan, a student council president who, in scheduling faculty-student discussions, quote, tries to take topics that appeal to both professors and students in order to stimulate discussion, though not of the same student council president when the story avoided the word take and said rather that, quote, he often picks topics that appeal to faculty and students. In condemning Dan, the subject did not just say things like, I don't know, I just have a gut feeling, or it just seems wrong. They came up with reasons. They said things like, Dan is a popularity-seeking snob. We need to devise reasons to go along with our gut feelings in order to feel comfortable in our own skins. If this is the case, and of course, one always can critique a particular study and how it's devised and so on and so forth. But if this is the case, it's hard to see how secrecy can provide a meaningful response to problems of rationalization. It is not surprising to find Bonhoeffer advocating that Christians should not even know their own goodness, because if they do know it, quote, it will really be your goodness and not the goodness of Christ, end quote. That is, it will be a form of works righteousness done for the sake of being seen, not the love that springs from Christ's grace. So Bonhoeffer argues that genuine deeds of love are hidden from the doer and spring from what he calls unconscious Christianity. But how can our deeds be hidden from ourselves and yet be meaningfully said to be our deeds? And how can we consciously cultivate unconscious Christianity? Malesic acknowledges that the effort might seem to be self-defeating. Quote, the paradox is that it takes discipline and self-reflection to become unreflective about one's faith, end quote. Once we begin to worry about the purity of our motivation, about our passionate concern for how we appear to others, about our penchant for post hoc rationalization, we seem doomed to ever more radical forms of suspicion and self-doubt. Haidt's recommendation offers a striking contrast. In lieu of secrecy, the light of day, in lieu of actions without reasons, Bonhoeffer's deeds that interpret themselves, an extra dose of reason giving, and in particular, the exchange of reasons with those who do not share our identities or belong to our communities. Because the flip side of our concern to justify ourselves is a concern to ask others to justify themselves, to hold others accountable for their actions and commitments. In research on accountability conducted by social psychologist Phil Tetlock, subjects who made decisions knowing they would not need to explain themselves exhibited the usual categories of errors, laziness, and reliance on gut feelings that has been documented in so much decision-making research. Those who knew that they would be held accountable by others approached their task more systematically and self-critically. Under such conditions, subjects are less likely to jump to premature judgments and more likely to revise their beliefs in response to evidence. However, if the decision makers approached the task with previously formed opinions on the topic, their energies were dedicated to amassing support for that view, the rider assiduously serving the elephant. So, only under very specific circumstances does the rider really seek truth. So, placing ourselves in context where others can hold us responsible for what we say and do is an important way to correct some of the vices and errors to which we are prone, vices and errors that concealment seems to foster. And there is a further twist here, for we are not simply self-interested, focused on burnishing our reputations. For one thing, human beings are not well described by rational choice theory. We are not primarily rational calculators, but are intuitive, seeking confirmation for what already feels right to us, even if that is something as insignificant and innocuous as a rule for generating a series of numbers. But more than this, we are, as Haidt puts it, less selfish than we are groupish. We favor our own political, ethnic, regional, religious groups, and our identity is deeply bound up with our identification with those groups. So, for instance, political scientists now recognize that people typically do not choose candidates or policies according to what will benefit them the most. They look not for what is in it for them, but what is in it for their group. There is an angelic side to this feature of human nature. Through our identification with our groups, we are drawn beyond ourselves. We are able to transcend self-interest. We find in our groups something higher than ourselves that is worth living for and even worth dying for. But there's also a demonic side to this groupishness. Much of the evil that we do is in service of our groups. We dismiss or demonize outsiders. We isolate ourselves within cocoons of like-minded individuals. This, of course, then enhances our confirmation biases. If the exchange of reasons with others is critical to our capacity to seek truth rather than simply rationalize what we already believe, surrounding ourselves with those who think just the way we do renders the process of reason-giving simply an exercise in reinforcing our convictions. Similarly, we accept norms for behavior that are operative within our own cocoons and justify our actions according to those norms, those expectations. In a community that is insulated from contact with those outside, there will be little call to reflect on the justifiability of the way we do things. Now, Haidt's attention is focused primarily on the dysfunctional divisiveness of contemporary American politics. The heart of his remedy is the exchange of reasons. Quote, if you put individuals together in the right way such that some individuals can use their reasoning powers to disconfirm the claims of others, and all individuals feel some common bond or shared fate that allows them to interact civilly, you can create a group that ends up producing good reasoning as an emergent property of the social system. That's why it's so important to have intellectual and ideological diversity within any group or institution whose goal is to find truth. What happens if we bring to bear on Christian identity this evidence concerning not just the tendency for the pursuit of reputation to trump the search for truth, but also for the ways in which our devotion to our groups reinforces our confirmation biases? One strand of Malesic's argument for the concealment of Christian identity has to do with guarding against the temptation to instrumentalize this identity for worldly gain and reputation. But there is another strand to his argument. So even if Malesic might be persuaded by Haidt that the light of day and the open exchange of reasons is finally a better guard against such corruption than is secrecy, he has another arrow in his quiver. The point here is not that Christianity, when openly displayed, is liable to be misused for personal profit, but something quite different. That Christianity, openly displayed, is bound to be both misunderstood and corrupted. Christian faith and identity will be misunderstood because they operate according to a logic that's oblique to that of the world, and their open display will lead to corruption by the alien logic of the world. So Malesic endorses Bonhoeffer's conviction that Christians must conceal their liturgical and prayer lives in order to protect Christian identity from being corrupted by Christians importing into the church the patterns of worldly thinking, including economic paradigms, status consciousness, and advantage seeking, paradigms that hold sway in public life. The possibility of genuine understanding and interaction is in effect precluded. Only those who have been formed by Christian practices, experientially initiated into the faith, are capable of understanding that faith. So Malesic urges Christians ought to guard against misunderstanding by concealing their identities and their reasons for acting from public view. Now, many faith traditions, as philosopher of religion John Pittard points out, embrace what he calls non-standard theories of epistemic credentials. That is to say, many religious traditions, or what he calls systems of religious belief, have embedded within them an implicit or perhaps explicit theory that makes controversial claims about what qualifies one to reliably assess religious propositions. These are claims that specifically downplay the relevance of the very criteria on which one would ordinarily rely in order to evaluate epistemic credentials, or the reasons for accepting some belief or form of life. We might ask, controversial or non-standard according to whom? The embrace of a non-standard theory of epistemic credentials seems possible only given an identity as a community of contrast, and moreover, as a minority community of contrast. The religious community employs a logic that is oblique to the dominant logic of the world. As the Apostle Paul proclaimed, quote, "The message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." So, given a non-standard theory of epistemic credentials, the believer has reason to doubt that the existence of disagreement with her belief should undermine her confidence in those beliefs. For why should she think that those who contest the plausibility of her beliefs are qualified to contest them? After all, they favor the standard theory of epistemic credentials, which she contests. One might think that this analysis ought to be cause for alarm and self-doubt. After all, it seems to underscore something that we pretty much knew already, which is that religious epistemologies are highly self-insulating. What this analysis identifies is the fact that members of one faith tradition do not simply refuse to listen to those who embrace other faiths. Rather, they develop theories that purportedly justify this refusal to listen. Embedded deep within their identities is a story about how outsiders will inevitably fail to understand them. Even if this does not disturb us in our own case as we point to Paul and the wisdom of God and the foolishness of a sinful and perishing world, it cannot fail to bother us when we think about parallel oblique logics functioning to insulate other faith traditions. Pittard acknowledges that the self-favoring characteristics of non-standard theories of epistemic credentials might offer reasons for doubting those theories, but only if the theory is post hoc, cobbled together in response to disagreement, as opposed to being an integral feature of the faith. Of course, it is often impossible definitively to determine whether or not such a theory is post hoc. So even partisan, opaque, and self-favoring theories can shrug off critique. Malesic recognizes that emphasizing the distinctiveness of Christian ethics can be a way of raising the cost of belonging to the group and therefore of binding the group more tightly together. But he does not acknowledge the vicious side of this. Similarly, he acknowledges that Cyril of Jerusalem's tactic of concealing certain secrets from baptismal candidates was a way of attracting them into the faith by way of exploiting their curiosity, but he does not see this manipulation as troubling or potentially problematic. He even recognizes that groups may invent distinctive features in order to create a strong sense of communal identity. Quote, without a real or imagined them to set one's own group in opposition to, there can be no us, no collective identity, end quote. Thus, demonization of outsiders seems inevitable. For Cyril, Malesic notes them included a hostile angel, the enemy, and the heretic. Malesic does anticipate the critique that concealment will, in his words, quote, render the church insular and thereby vulnerable to ideology and self-enclosed groupthink, end quote. His remedy for this form of corruption is divine transcendence rather than communication. If transcendence means simply crossing boundaries, he writes, then admitting outside criticism of the church is a form of it, albeit a weak one, as only a social boundary is being crossed. The transcendence that should matter most to Christians is the transcendence of the human affected by divine grace and revelation. This determined contrast between divine transcendence and merely immanent social forms of transcendence is telling. How, we might ask, will the divine transcendence that corrects our insularity come to us? Malesic turns toward radical subjectivity. Quote, the Christian individual comes to understand himself or herself before God through the introspective activities of self-scrutiny, self-reflection, and self-suspicion, activities that attempt to imitate God's activity of knowing and loving, but also judging the person, end quote. So on one hand, Malesic acknowledges that these activities only attempt to imitate God's knowing and loving. But on the other hand, given his distrust of the social mediation of grace and revelation, it is unsurprising that one of his first instincts is to look inside, to look within the subject. The other move that he makes is to add to the call for the insistence on purely intramural debate over the proper character of Christian identity, a call for immanent criticism to guard against ideological cabals and sinful self-deception. But it's far from clear how purely immanent criticism can guard against the failures of cocoon-like groupishness. This is not to deny divine transcendence, not to deny that, as Graham Ward has put it, quote, the church's actions and speech address the world from a point beyond it, end quote. But it is to insist that the church is always within the world and struggling to discern God's truth. As Ward goes on to say, quote, there is no voice from above, not even in the Christian scripture, no voice that descends unmediated from some empyrean realm, end quote. The voice from above that comes to us within our messy social existences. Divine transcendence is not to be contrasted with divine immanence, but it is beyond our ordinary contrast between transcendent and immanent. Malesic, however, sees only two possibilities. Either the divine is immanent and secrets are forbidden, or the divine is transcendent and secrets are inevitable. He approvingly notes that Kierkegaard's Abraham disregards any argument that may come from outside, even as Abraham is always open to hearing God's voice. But being open to arguments from the outside is integral to being open to hearing God's voice. Not secrecy and concealment, but the exchange of reasons, both within and beyond Christian community, is critical to the task of discernment. Malesic draws explicitly on Kierkegaard's vindication of the particular over the universal in support of his argument for Christian concealment. In doing so, he transforms Kierkegaard's insistence on the radically individual and interior character of the God relationship into a familiar communitarian critique of the universal. To be governed by universal ethical principles is, he charges, to lose one's particularity. Quote, the universality of the ethical requires a person always to consider himself or herself as only a moral agent or a citizen, to abstract from all the experience, self-interest, personal history, and communal memberships that would mark someone as an individual, and to act solely upon maxims accessible to any other moral agent, end quote. It's quite a feat to transform Kierkegaard into a communitarian. But doing so is crucial to Malesic's appropriation of Kierkegaard in support of his program of communal concealment. But if we focus on what it means to have a reason for acting, rather than on fidelity to abstract universal ethical principles, it becomes evident that reason-giving is in no way hostile to particularity. An intentional action is one that can intelligibly be said to have been done for a reason. And a reason in this sense is something that can occupy a certain place in a social practice of holding others responsible for what they do. An intention is not a mental event, not something that happens in a person's mind before they act. Sometimes an intention is explicitly formed in the mind, sometimes not. Even something I do automatically by habit can be intentional. I approach my final turn while driving to the office and I switch on the turn signal, not having thought about it at all. Yet, if you were to ask me, why did you switch on that turn signal? I would say something like, because my turn was coming up. The reason I give has its proper place in our social practice of exchanging reasons. Malesic contrasts responsibility to the neighbor, which he says may require secrecy, with obedience to universal principles, of which he is quite dismissive. Responsibility for someone else is radically individual, he says. It cannot be communicated to another and typically does not give a public account of itself. But responsibility in the form of reason-giving is part and parcel of our responsibility to neighbor, not something that can be set over against that responsibility. The process of giving reasons for our actions is highly contextual. It is not a matter of rigidly imposing universal principles, or better, universal principles are not the sort of thing that can be well followed in a rigid fashion. To give reasons for our actions is itself a form of attentiveness to particularity. Just as I must attend to whether my neighbor's need is for companionship or material assistance, I must attend to whether the reasons I am giving are intelligible to the neighbor in all of her particularity. I can't offer my toddler the categorical imperative as I take away the 5th cookie she has snatched. I must meet her where she is, and so it is for all of our reason-giving. This means that different semantic frames are the name of the game, not some insurmountable barrier to communication. We are always striving to offer reasons to others that are intelligible to them, given their own perspectives and commitments. And the reasons we articulate to ourselves or within our community will not be the same as those articulated in another. To offer appropriate reasons in this way is not to manipulate others, but to show them respect. I noted at the outset that the understanding of Christian faith evidenced in Kierkegaard's critique of Christendom resonates more fully with the Radical Reformation than with Catholicism, Pace Walter Lowry, with the notable caveat that Kierkegaard has a weak ecclesiology and no notion of the church as a contrast community of witness. It's fitting then to close by turning to a theologian of the Radical Reformation, John Howard Yoder. Yoder was certainly as unrelenting a critic of Christendom as Kierkegaard, as convinced that genuine Christianity by its nature courted martyrdom. For Yoder, it was Constantinianism, reinvented anew in every age, that had subverted and continues to subvert an authentic Christian ethic of peaceful servanthood. Yet Yoder did not call for secrecy or concealment. The practice of exchanging reasons is central to both his negative and his positive Christian cases for democracy. Now, Malesic is not arguing against democracy, and Kierkegaard certainly had no interest in democracy one way or the other, but a commitment to exchanging reasons is at the heart of what Yoder is talking about here, and such a commitment is undermined by the notion that Christian discipleship calls for deliberate secrecy and concealment. First, Yoder argued that Christians were called to servanthood, that the fact that Christians were called to servanthood did not mean that they should not ask others for reasons and hold them responsible for living up to the commitments that they themselves had made. He notes in particular that while Christians are not to play the game of rulers making a case for their benevolence, they may and should use this game as leverage for critique. If the ruler claims to be my benefactor, and he always does, says Yoder, then that claim provides me, as his subject, with the language that I can use to call him to be more humane in his ways of governing me and my neighbors. I am quite free to use his language to reach him. So Christians are to hold non-Christians responsible for their commitments, asking them to account for their actions in light of their own beliefs and values. This does not mean that the faith community speaks to itself in the same way as it speaks to the nations. As I just argued, diverse semantic frames are the norm, not the exception. Reason giving is always radically context dependent. But in addition to this negative case for democracy, Yoder also articulates a more positive case, which properly arises in those places where their numbers or their virtues or their friends or their good luck should give to Christians a chance for positive model building. Here, the church is offered as a model for the civil commonwealth in the specific sense of offering a model of a community in which all are free to speak and all are to listen critically to what is spoken. Quote, if that is the way divine truth is to be articulated in the words of our world, then those who have learned those skills of listening critically and speaking prophetically should be able as well to apply them to debates about human justice, end quote. The ongoing dialectical communal process of discerning God's word is lived out both for itself and as a model for all discernment. This is, in fact, one instantiation of the logic of servanthood. We do not seek to manipulate others by strategically or tantalizingly concealing and revealing various truths or commitments. Rather, we exchange reasons, we hold others accountable, and allow them to hold us accountable, because to do so is to acknowledge their dignity as creatures made in the image of God. We hear distant echoes of this positive Christian case for democracy in Oliver O'Donovan's articulation of openness to speech as one of the features of liberal order that reflects the lasting formation of Western culture by the triumph of Christ over the powers. Civil speech cannot be prayer or prophecy, but it can be an order in which political authorities, quote, have to confront and accommodate the free discourse of a society which has learned to recognize authority also in the words spoken by God by manservants and maidservants, as the prophecy of Joel has said, end quote. This is for O'Donovan the heart of democracy, not rule by and for the people and their whims and inclinations, but a civil society in which one person's voice may be heard to the same extent as another's, where responsibilities are not so structured and assigned that deliberation about the public good is confined to a particular class of deliberators. But what if both the church and the larger society are horribly corrupt? What can then be gained by the exchange of reasons? To honor others by holding them accountable for their misdeeds, as well as by offering them reasons for one's own deeds, is nevertheless a way of honoring their dignity as children of God, however that dignity has been debased. But here, a special sort of prophetic identity accrues to the activity of reason-giving, as one's reasons appeal to a future community, more capable of fairly assessing them than the corrupt communities of the present. As O'Donovan argues, quote, the conscience of the individual members of a community is a repository of the moral understanding which shaped it and may serve to perpetuate it in a crisis of collapsing morale or institutions. It does so by appealing for its own justification backward to an integral tradition in the past, but also, I would argue, forward to the eschatological community, the community that has rightly discerned the Word of God. I meet Abraham heading up Mount Moriah, Isaac in tow. What are you up to, I ask. We're going to sacrifice to the Lord. Where's your goat? Abraham's refusal to answer at this point breaks off his responsibility to me. It forecloses the possibility on his part and mine of discernment into what God is requiring of him and why. I don't need a goat. The Lord has told me to sacrifice Isaac. But why would God do that? How is that consistent with everything else that we know of God? Abraham's attempt to offer reasons for his actions opens up the possibility for shared discernment. This shared discernment will take different forms depending on the extent to which interlocutors share a common form of life, beliefs, assumptions, history. But while the process will not always lead to mutual understanding or acceptance, it is a process that breaks Abraham out of a cocoon of isolation in which he is more likely to meet the demons of delusion than the Trinitarian God of communal exchange. Similarly, it's a mistake to think that Christian communities will be protected from economic paradigms, status consciousness, and advantage seeking if only they insulate themselves from engagement with other groups. Rather, we need to recognize that these tendencies already permeate Christian communities, and that interaction and exchange assists us in immanent criticism and discernment of the word that we are to speak from beyond, rather than infecting our communities with diseases that are now foreign to ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Herdt. Our second presenter is Paul Martens, Associate Professor of Religion here at Baylor University. Professor Martens holds degrees from Providence and Regent Colleges in Canada and the University of Notre Dame. He has authored the volume The Heterodox Yoder. His presentation today is Kierkegaard and the Peaceable Kingdom, or Why Kierkegaard and Hauerwas Would Be Frenemies. Professor Martens.
Thanks, Bill. This is a grad student's dream. Almost a decade ago, I was defending my dissertation, and Jennifer was one of those committee members, and I recognize I still have a lot to learn. Good times. I have a third title to this paper as well that isn't on your program, and it's a little more biographical. So the third title would be, or a one-sided commentary addressed to my colleagues who graduated from Duke. All right. Just last year, a volume about Søren Kierkegaard's influence on Anglophone and Scandinavian theology was published in the Kierkegaard Research Sources, Reception, and Resources series. Some of the American and British theologians one might expect were addressed in this volume: Reinhold Niebuhr, Harvey Cox, John Macquarie, H.R. Mackintosh, and even Jean Outcott. One of the more influential 20th century American theologians not addressed in this volume, however, is Stanley Hauerwas. Now, there are good reasons for this, not the least of which are A, Hauerwas has never written anything directly about Kierkegaard, and B, he has never claimed to be a Kierkegaardian of any stripe. That said, what I want to present this afternoon is a small beginning in the direction of rectifying Hauerwas' omission from this volume. Of course, to use the language of omission in this context implies that Hauerwas has been denied his rightful place in Kierkegaard's theological legacy. I do believe this to be the case, and I'll begin my comments by attempting to explain why I have come to this conclusion. I cannot help, right up front, noting several superficial and perhaps not so superficial parallels between the 19th century Dane and the late 20th century Texan. First, they are both rather polemical characters, with a flair for offending their respective audiences. And only one of them lived long enough to mellow just a little bit. That's Hauerwas. Second, their polemics are profoundly shaped by their historical and theological context. Kierkegaard would not be Kierkegaard without the immediate provocations of Hegel, Münster, Martensen, Heiberg, Copenhagen, or Danish Christendom, which loops back again to Hegel. Hauerwas would not be Hauerwas without the immediate provocations of Reinhold Niebuhr, Richard McBrien, John Howard Yoder, David Burrell, Texas, and all that means, and what Hauerwas calls America's God, which loops back to Reinhold Niebuhr again. Third, they both frame their polemics as a means, quote, to use Kierkegaard's phrase, of reintroducing Christianity into Christendom. Both argue for a more strenuous Christianity, and for both, Jesus plays a pivotal role in this reintroduction. For Kierkegaard, Jesus' suffering and death become normative for Christian imitation. For Hauerwas, Jesus' nonviolence becomes normative for the community of faith. Now, if we pause for a moment to consider this brief and very preliminary list of parallels that are observable at a glance, we begin to realize that these observable similarities probably rest on other parallels that run through the core of their theologies. Finally, after many years of relative silence on the matter, Hauerwas has acknowledged his direct and indirect debts to Kierkegaard publicly. In his memoir, Hannah's Child, Hauerwas recounts elements of his studies at Yale, and this is what he says. I read as much Kierkegaard as I could get my hands on. I was sure Kierkegaard was right to put the stress on the how of faith the how of faith as necessary for understanding the what. Put differently, I was learning from Homer's account of Kierkegaard that theology is best understood as a form of practical reason. Moreover, I learned from Kierkegaard that the truth of practical reason is Christ, and thus practical reason cannot be constrained by the accommodated form of the church identified with Christendom. Now, Hauerwas' assessment is straightforward to this point, and if this is all that there was to say, one may be tempted to conclude that Kierkegaard and Hauerwas are basically in agreement about the things that matter in theology and ethics. But Hauerwas then continues by appropriating Karl Barth's claim that one must pass through the school of Kierkegaard because the very character of Kierkegaard's attack on the human-centered pietism of his day had the ironic effect of fortifying a quite similar pietism in ours. End of quote. Then, as if to partially back out of what appears to be an emerging critique of Kierkegaard, Hauerwas concludes, some may wonder if Kierkegaard really exerted such an influence on me, because I seldom reference him. It is a good question, but I think he always haunts me. In truth, I decided early on that Kierkegaard is one of those figures that require you to live with them on a daily basis if you are to use their work well. I decided I would live with others, partly because I simply did not want to negotiate the unending scholarly debates concerning Kierkegaard. Now, in my estimation, this final paragraph of Hauerwas' confession is a half-truth, and a little bit misleading one at that. What I mean is this. Yes, part of the reason Hauerwas chose to live with others is the unending scholarly debates surrounding Kierkegaard, and there are not many of you in this room who would disagree with this assessment of the scholarship today, I think. But what is the other part of the rationale for not choosing to live with Kierkegaard? In what follows, I would like, A, to propose to begin to fill out the other part of why Hauerwas could not live with Kierkegaard, and B, to suggest why Kierkegaard should still haunt him. My proposal takes us back to their respective readings of their contexts and the different, and perhaps even opposite, directions they take in their efforts to reintroduce Christianity. But before jumping ahead of myself, allow me to sketch the competing contours of the reintroduction to Christianity. So part B, reintroducing Christianity, different solutions for different perceptions of the problem. If you've read more than just a little bit of either Hauerwas or Kierkegaard, you too have probably noticed that it is virtually impossible to nail them down to one succinct claim on any given topic. Kierkegaard may not have been so brazen as to write Hauerwas' self-justifying assertion, and I quote, "I do not believe that repetition is a fault, but only repetition that is boring can be faulted." That's Hauerwas. But there are moments when it appears that Kierkegaard performs this very claim as well. That said, both provide relatively consistent analyses of the problem they perceive in their respective contexts. And for Hauerwas, as much as for Kierkegaard, how the problem is framed plays a pivotal role in how the solution is articulated. For Kierkegaard, first, the problem was that enormous illusion, Christendom. Of course, mid-19th century Danish Christianity was neither united nor univocal in all kinds of ways. What Kierkegaard was driving at, however, is that basic assumption at the bottom of the manifold expressions of Danish Christianity, namely that Danish Christians were not living according to the Christianity displayed in the New Testament. Or, to restate, Danish Christianity operated on the assumption that knowing Christian doctrines or scriptures was sufficient for justifying the illusory appellation Christian. His criticism is, in short, not a criticism of Christianity, but a criticism of the idea that the proclamation of Christianity could take place without reduplication, and by that he means the living of these proclamations in one's actual life. For this reason, Kierkegaard targeted the leaders of Danish Christendom that perpetuated what he took to be false Christianity, the state-employed clergy and the ubiquitous university assistant professors. For Hauerwas, the problem is also tied to a problematic relationship between God and country. But Hauerwas's context is decidedly post-Christian. At bottom, the problem seems to be that, quote, the ever-present power of God's kingdom to form our Christian imagination has been subordinated to the interests of furthering liberal ideals through the mechanisms of the state. Or, to restate, theological convictions have lost their intelligibility because accounts of the Christian moral life have, quote, too long been accommodated to the needs of the nation state, especially the needs of the nation state we call the United States of America. For Hauerwas, one need look no further than the now familiar American practice of justifying the killing of Christians in other countries on the grounds of some value entailed by national loyalties. For this reason, Hauerwas targets the leaders of American Christianity, both in the church and in seminaries and universities, and especially the architects and perpetuators of the academic subdiscipline known as Christian social ethics. And apparently my PhD is in that field. Stated this way, I hope it is clear that there is profound agreement between Kierkegaard and Hauerwas on at least this. Identifying Christianity with one's national identity is a problem that fundamentally alters Christianity. That said, there is a contextual difference that ought to be reiterated because it is a difference that serves to orient their alternate therapeutic visions. In short, the difference in context lies, at least initially, in the religious status of the nation states in question. Denmark was officially Christian, while America is officially secular, even if we debate what exactly that means. In Denmark, Kierkegaard could assume at least a nominal sympathy between Christianity and the state, while in America, Hauerwas assumes there is more than a nominal antipathy between Christianity and the state. The net result of this difference is that the background against which Christianity is reintroduced is more ambiguous and certainly less cohesive or stable for Hauerwas. And it is against this ominous background that Hauerwas's criticism of Kierkegaard's emphasis emerges. Let me step back a moment to explain why this difference matters. In his own words, Kierkegaard's project is concerned with becoming a Christian. The issue is not what Christianity is, the Christianity is how Christianity is lived. He simply assumes that Danes have grown up with Bibles on their nightstands and a culturally appropriate appreciation for regular church attendance. Therefore, the lifelong task that is still missing is an existential appropriation of the what of Christianity. The category that Kierkegaard appropriates for this task is the individual. Why does he do so? The answer is fairly simple. Only individuals can become Christians. Only as an individual can one relate oneself most truly to God. If this is true, however, Kierkegaard's task is complicated by the fact that people simply do not live in isolation. In fact, they live in Christendom. To address this reality, Kierkegaard's first task, then, in reintroducing Christianity is a negative task. Namely, to separate the individual from the race, the crowd, the public, etc. Much of his pseudonymous authorship attempts to play this role, and one can think especially here of Fear and Trembling as a representative of his concern for elevating the first movement of faith, infinite resignation, that is, the act of giving up the things of this world as determinative or normative. In this vein, Socrates and Abraham are both presented as individuals par excellence. But this is not the end of the story. This is just the beginning. The purpose of this first movement is to clear the decks, if you will, to make it possible for an individual to encounter God face to face, to make it possible for an individual to have an absolute relation to the absolute. And it is this God relationship, which the later works describe as mediated and qualified by Christ's life that leads to death, that then defines the entirety of Christian existence. In this God relationship, the single individual remains contemporaneous with Christ in some fashion through all subsequent social or cultural encounters. This is the second movement of faith. Kierkegaard is extremely critical of anything additional that claims to stand between stand between these two movements other than God. That is, he is critical of anything that attempts to further mediate Christianity to the individual, including but not limited to the state, the church, biblical scholars, philosophers and theologians, and even the state-funded clergy of his day. In sum, therefore, Kierkegaard's corpus leads in the direction of a portrayal of true Christianity that is performed by practicing the arduous and humbling individual task of imitating Christ on the way that leads to death. And it is at this point that the differences between Hauerwas and Kierkegaard are brought into full relief. Clearly moving in a direction other than that pursued by Kierkegaard, Hauerwas, in the Peaceable Kingdom, begins to outline his own version of true Christianity. Pulling no punches, he states, "The theme of imitation is subject, however, to much misunderstanding. In particular, it carries with it individualist presuppositions that are antithetical to the social nature of the Christian life." And he then continues, "Therefore, one can only learn how to be virtuous, to be like Jesus, by learning from others how that is done. To be like Jesus requires that I become part of a community that practices virtues, not that I copy his life point by point." In his later In Good Company, Hauerwas is even more forthright. And he says this, "I should not hide the fact that informing this account of the church is a different understanding of salvation than is assumed by many Christians today. I have little use for the current fascination with individual salvation in either its conservative or liberal guises. I do not assume that salvation is first and foremost about my life having meaning or ensuring my eternal destiny. Rather, salvation is being engrafted into practices that save us from those powers that would rule our lives, making it impossible for us to truly worship God." For Hauerwas, reintroducing Christianity is akin to learning to master a game of cricket or baseball. It is no less strenuous than Kierkegaard's version of imitating Christ. It entails the willingness to suffer nonviolently, but most importantly, it is like a game in that its performance requires the participation of other skilled players, good company, if you will. In fact, Hauerwas will go so far as claiming that, quote, "the church's politics is our salvation," end quote. But why is this nearly hyperbolic claim the solution to the problems of American Christianity? A word on Hauerwas's biography is a good place to start as any to begin to answer this question. In short, Hauerwas grew up in the Methodist tradition. Sorry if any of you are Methodists who are offended by his narration, but here goes. He confesses, perhaps a little tongue-in-cheek, that before he was 15, he had, quote, "all the experience and self-understanding he could use for a lifetime." There are some of you who might disagree about his self-understanding of his self-understanding, but that's another story altogether. Hauerwas calls this sort of anthropologically oriented concern about human behavior a pathology of liberal Methodism. Or to echo a Kierkegaardian concern, he asserts that his liberal Methodist Christianity had no way to resist the endemic character of modernity, bent as it is on turning faith into just another idea. Yet rather than seeing Kierkegaard as an ally in the resistance to modernity and its fixation on knowing, Hauerwas worries that Kierkegaard, with his emphasis on the individual, inadvertently has allied himself with the human-centered pietism of today that cannot resist giving in to the powerful temptations of the nation-state. And to further illuminate Hauerwas's equivocation concerning Kierkegaard's Christian corrective, it is worth noting that he understands one of his greatest theological enemies to be Reinhold Niebuhr, the leading spokesman of Christian realism in mid-20th century America, and a thinker who was profoundly influenced by Kierkegaard. Therefore, according to Hauerwas, true Christianity cannot be cultivated by returning to an emphasis on the individual. True Christianity must be cultivated in a political community that stands as a witness to all other political arrangements. The church is a polis, after all. And he says, "For that is the heart of the matter, namely practices. Practices make the church the embodiment of Christ for the world." Admittedly, much more beyond this rough sketch can and should be said about the restorative aspirations of both Kierkegaard and Hauerwas. Yet what I hope is clear by this point is that Hauerwas did not choose to live with Kierkegaard on a daily basis because, at least in part, he did not believe Kierkegaard offered resources for affirming and cultivating a sufficiently political ecclesial community. Or to restate in negative terms, he seems to think that Kierkegaard's individualized Christianity can too easily be co-opted by the corrosive politics of the nation-state. In the few minutes remaining, I would like to revisit Kierkegaard's alleged individualism and imagine how he could respond to Hauerwas, which is probably something different from imagining how he would respond to Hauerwas. My purpose here is not to vindicate Kierkegaard, though I suspect a partial vindication is in order. My purpose here is simply to demonstrate why Kierkegaard still haunts Hauerwas, as he should. So part C, why Kierkegaard still haunts Hauerwas as he should. That Kierkegaard is weak on the church is not a new claim. Some of his contemporaries charged him with this, and Barth reiterated something of the sort half a century ago. Yet the passionate disagreement between Michael Plecon and Bruce Kermsey in the pages of Faith and Philosophy over a decade ago demonstrates that this is still a very open question. In the past, admittedly, I have been less than charitable to Kierkegaard concerning his understanding of the church, leaning on Kierkegaard's image of the Holy Spirit as a royal coachman that drives Christians as if they were a team of horses. I may have been known to suggest that existence in Kierkegaard's church is akin to working as hard as you can with nothing to see but another horse's ass. I suspect Hauerwas would appreciate that image, and I apologize for that. Today, I will take Kierkegaard's side, or at least I will take up two particular questions that Kierkegaard could press in a way that still haunts Hauerwas. The first question could be stated as follows. Where is this church in which one learns the nonviolent politics that is our salvation? I do not ask this as a rhetorical question. I ask this question because it seems to me that Kierkegaard turned to an individual relationship with God as central simply because he discovered that the Danish church, much like Hauerwas's assessment of the American church, was not practicing Christianity. But if the American church is not practicing Christian politics or virtue, how can the church be the context in which one learns to master Christian existence? If Hauerwas's answer is that the church of which he speaks is best understood diachronically, that is, the church as a community of saints throughout time, he and Kierkegaard would be of one mind. If Hauerwas's church is constituted as a people of memory who are guided by the memories preserved in Scripture and the lives of the saints, then he and Kierkegaard would have considerable common ground. In fact, it is the apostles and representatives of the early church that Kierkegaard would often use to illuminate the failures of Danish Christendom. They were the real truth witnesses. If this is what Hauerwas means, then he has a critical platform from which to judge elements of American Christianity in much the same way Kierkegaard judged Danish Christianity. And I hope this parallel reveals that Kierkegaard is actually less individualistic and ahistoric than he sometimes sounds. But if Hauerwas literally means that the local church that practices inadequate politics is a sufficient context for discovering and developing the right politics of peace, then something else needs to be at work. If this is the case, the something else would be the grace of God working through the sacraments, which Hauerwas also considers political practices. This fact would help us make sense of his claim that the church is God's creation and not ours. But if that is the case, then again, the difference between Kierkegaard and Hauerwas may not be as large as expected. Kierkegaard too believes Christians are absolutely dependent on grace. This is the major premise of Christianity. And as Kierkegaard states in his journals and papers, the intention of Christianity was to introduce grace into life in order to transform all life. Of course, stepping back for a moment, I suspect Hauerwas would rightly argue that the two understandings of church I have suggested cannot really be separated. Accepting that answer for the time being, Kierkegaard could still press the question of Christianity's minor premise, namely works. He would ask what Jesus demands of individual Christians. He would ask what individual Christians are responsible for doing. And this would force the question of whether or in what way Christians are individually responsible to God. John Howard Yoder, to whom Hauerwas acknowledged all kinds of theological debts, has argued that unless an individual can say yes or no to God, no moral agency can be attributed to that individual. This is the point that Kierkegaard drives at repeatedly throughout his corpus. Hauerwas, on the other hand, is so allergic to post-Enlightenment voluntarism that his emphasis always falls on what God has already accomplished. For example, faith is to be initiated into a kingdom. We are in Christ insofar as we are part of that community pledged to be faithful. Justification is only another way of talking about sanctification. Through the story of Jesus, we learn to be what we have become, and the list could go on. These convictions lead Hauerwas to claim that, quote, the question of the nature and form of the church is the center of any attempt to develop Christian ethics. This claim, however, opens the door to the second question that Kierkegaard could ask Hauerwas, and it is drawn from the pages of Fear and Trembling. And I'd frame the question this way. Does a Christian actually have a direct relationship with God? In Problema 2 of Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard argues that if all ethical responsibilities can be traced back to God without requiring that an individual enter into a direct relationship with God, then God becomes unnecessary, a vanishing point, he would say. Of course, Kierkegaard has Hegel in mind here, but I think he would also worry about Hauerwas's narration of the church for very similar reasons. Allow me to paraphrase the challenge of problem 2 in Hauerwasian terms. I'd say it this way. Begin with, I need to participate in the politics of the church. I need to do this because God is at work in the politics of the church, and I need to make the story of Jesus my own story. But in learning the politics of the church, that is, participating in salvation, I do not enter into an individual relationship with God, but rather I enter into relationships with the good company of the church. If this is the case, then God becomes an abstraction that cannot be separated from the politics of the church. The politics of the church then, quote, and then borrowing directly from Kierkegaard, rounds itself off as a perfect self-contained sphere, and the politics of the church becomes that which limits and fills at one and the same time. God comes to be an invisible vanishing point, an impotent thought. His power is only in the church's politics, which fills the entirety of Christian existence. Admittedly, Hauerwas's corpus is a bit like Augustine's or the Bible. You can find pretty much anything you are looking for in it. But one thing that is nearly impossible to find is precisely what Kierkegaard holds most dear, an absolute relation to the absolute. Hauerwas has very good reason to doubt the merits of so much individualized liberal Christianity in our day. He has very good reason to react to certain forms of strident American evangelicalism. He has very good reasons for pointing to the Anabaptist as exemplars of a certain form of church politics. Yet, to return to the ecclesial community and identify it as our salvation may be an overcorrection. To return to the ecclesial community and identify it as our salvation may simply replace the idolatry of the nation state with an idolatry of a different kind. All subsequent claims like, quote, when everything is said and done, everything the church says and does is done because God matters, do little to disqualify the second Kierkegaardian question indicated above. And if this question does not haunt Hauerwas, it should. To conclude, I want to be clear that I do not take this final question, again, to be a rhetorical question. I take it to be an open question. I think Kierkegaard could learn a considerable amount from Hauerwas. In fact, I don't think one can or should return to an unreconstructed Kierkegaard today. But that is not what I've attempted to argue in this context. Instead, I have attempted to suggest where Hauerwas might have something to learn from Kierkegaard. I have focused on Hauerwas's emphasis on politics throughout the paper because of his own emphasis. But I suspect that replacing politics with language, as Hauerwas has discussed more recently, would yield the same result. Despite the promising theological conviction that Jesus is already victorious, Hauerwas's politics, which is to say Hauerwas's Christianity, comes to be a complete and finished system in which the church effectively contains and constrains God's salvific work. But, at least according to Kierkegaard, a God constrained by the church is really no God at all. And that conclusion is more than sufficiently haunting, even for Halloween. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Martens. We come now to a time of some conversation. We have time for that. We have microphones at the front, and so I would ask if you have a question that you make your way to the microphone and ask your question, and our presenters can then respond to them. Please feel free to do that. But let me first ask, do you all have a question you would like to ask each other? Or not?
There are a lot of interesting things to, I don't think, is this on? Can you hear?
No, it's coming.
Seems like it's slightly on. Is that adequately on? No.
Come to the
Well, I think there are lots of interesting things we could talk about together. I think that we're much closer than it might appear from what we have to say. So one way to start to begin to engage on this would be to turn to this question about the absolute relation to the absolute, and to ask what you would ideally want Hauerwas to say. Were he really truly listening to Kierkegaard on this question?
sure.
The same problem. Sure.
I'm not sure I'd say to Hauerwas I'd want to say to Hauerwas. I don't think I would use that. I would. Kierkegaard uses the phrase "the absolute relation to the absolute." I'm not sure I would use that phrase, but what I would want to say to Hauerwas is there a way in which one is responsible to God, or is there a way in which God speaks to people and demands things of people that isn't directly or even indirectly mediated through the church? And here's where something like the biblical texts that point to things like the nations are responsible for what they know, not to the same extent that, say, Israel is, but in the sense that there is God's at work in the world, within the church certainly, but perhaps outside of the church. And I don't think Hauerwas's church is his God and Christianity is so tied to ecclesial practices that I don't think he would deny that God's at work in the world. He would just have no way of narrating that. And I would want to say that both within the church and without the church, there has to be some way, and we can use whatever, language, opportunity, whatever language you'd want to use here is I think there's many options. But I think what you'd want to be careful to say is that we can't capture God in our language, and we can't capture God in our politics. And there is always, I would always want to suggest there's at least a remainder beyond our practices and our knowledge and our language.
So I find it fascinating that you move in that direction. I'm not actually surprised because I know where you're coming from, but it's interesting that you move in that direction because one could think that if the question that Kierkegaard poses to Hauerwas is fundamentally about the absolute relation to the absolute, that you would be plugging for a move like the one that Malesic is making, right? To say, so we have to correct this communitarianism by turning to our encounter as individuals with God in some private introspective space, which is not at all what you're doing. You're actually saying, let's turn to God. Let's be looking for God at work in the world. Not a very Kierkegaardian answer, I think.
Maybe not. And I wouldn't hold those necessarily mutually exclusive.
Say more about that.
More.
So I take it what you're trying to say is that what we really want to hold on to from this Kierkegaardian notion of the absolute relation to the absolute is not at all captured by the sense that this is something that is necessarily unmediated. It may look like a claim about an unmediated relationship to God, but in fact, it's a claim that our relationship to God, which even if it's in some sense an absolute relationship, is mediated in all sorts of respects. So it's mediated, yes, by the community of the church, which is what Hauerwas has taught us so well, but it's also mediated in so many other ways as well. We really would like you to come up and ask some questions.
May I ask a question then? Paul, you mentioned toward the end a concern about God becoming an abstraction. How do we in this conversation avoid the problem of the church becoming an abstraction? That seems also to be something that runs through these issues.
Yeah, I think what has happened is that the church has become an abstraction in the same way that the individual has become an abstraction. And I think, and my challenge to Hauerwas, and this is where I think I don't want to go either all Kierkegaard or all Hauerwas here, and I'm not exactly sure how to reconcile the two. I'm still young, lots of time. But what I'd want to say is that, if the overcorrection here has placed the church in a position where it can't actually do the work it's required to do, and I think that the church that is required doesn't exist it's more, I would see it more as a hypothetical church, which would be great, but it's idealized in a way that I think is incredibly problematic, and it can't actually do the work that he thinks it, or he hopes it does.
So is O'Donovan the answer then?
No, that's why I take it to be an open question. I think we're now, Hauerwas has had his say, and I think it's been a very good say, but I think now the question is open for the next generation to kind of take what Hauerwas has to say, but then I think try not to overreact in the other way.
Okay,
Yes.
I think I can break the ice here a little bit. I'll speak up on this. I have a question for Professor Herdt about the silence. So I take it you're not real happy with the last problem in Fear and Trembling where Kierkegaard said Abraham must be silent. And I'm a little more happy with that, so I thought I'd ask you about that. So I don't take it that he's saying that everything we as Christians do we must be silent about, that there are never any publicly intelligible reasons for the things that we do. I think what he's saying is that at least some of the time, it's possible that we will find ourselves in situations where there are no publicly intelligible reasons for what we do, and the reason for that is that we have knowledge of God directly from God that is not publicly available. And so simply we can't give evidence that others have. And so they're going to find what we do rather absurd. And I actually thought that was kind of interesting. The illustration you started out with at the end of your paper, that was fascinating, where somebody goes up and asks Abraham, why are you doing what you're doing? He says, God told me to kill my son. And the guy says, how is that consistent with the character of God? I think somebody who doesn't even believe in God or doesn't think God speaks to us directly the way Hegel and Kant thought. How is Abraham possibly going to give an answer that this guy's not going to think is crazy? Like that's, and I think that's Kierkegaard's point. And I thought your illustration really supported his point. You stopped there and you said Abraham is now brought out of himself. And I don't think so. The only way he's brought out of himself is as a temptation to disobey God, it seems like in that case. I'm worried. I honestly can't think of an answer Abraham could give that would be publicly intelligible at that point. Because he's the only one that heard the command from God. I mean, that's the fundamental reason for that.
Okay. Thank you. I thought I heard you shifting around a little bit in the way you were describing that. So when you started, I thought you were saying that we're talking about a situation in which the individual has really radically private knowledge of God. But then I heard you shifting in your description of the little story that I told to a situation where the problem is that we're talking about an atheist trying to, engage in some reason-giving process with Abraham, which I take it to be a somewhat different thing. So a lot of what I was saying about the process of exchanging reasons is that when we're engaged in that, it's a process of trying to figure out what the other can hear as a reason for his or her own action. So in this case, the question is, how is that consistent? It could be not how is that consistent with everything else we know of God, but how is that consistent with everything else that you yourself are committed to about God? That is, that there is a somewhat different form that this process of exchanging reasons will take. In fact, a lot of what I was saying is that it's always a very particular form. You can't just say, oh, we know what the exchange of reasons is going to look like, because what it's going to look like is going to depend on person A and person B, what person A is committed to, what person B is committed to, whatever commitments they share, whatever commitments they understand that the other is committed to, even though they themselves are not committed to it, and so on. So there I would want to say, well, there's lots of conversation that can go on between the atheist and the Christian on this that I think could be a very productive conversation, even though they really don't, at the end of the day, agree on some very, very crucial things. But that seems to be a different claim than the one you started out with, which is about some kind of radically private knowledge of God.
Okay, great. One follow-up then on that. So it sounds like what you're saying is here would be a candidate for Abraham. Hey, I believe that I've had a private revelation from God. I believe in God. And you're saying the other person can say, okay, even though I've not heard the private revelation, even though maybe I don't believe in God or I don't think God speaks, I can at least see where you're coming from and get your idea. even though I think what you're doing is completely wrong, you're completely wrong about that, I kind of get your point. So that would constitute a publicly intelligible reason that Abraham could give. What's interesting about that is crazy people can give exactly that sort of publicly intelligible reason. They always have a very good reason from their perspective, right? But I don't think that's meeting Kierkegaard's standards for publicly intelligible. That is rational by public standards, I think. It's not that I understand where you're coming from. That's not enough for publicly intelligible, because that's not different than crazy people can have that, right? It needs to be publicly intelligible in the sense of being rational by public standards. That kind of reason, I think, we don't always have. I think Kierkegaard's right that we can't always give that.
Sure, but it's not, in this case, the problem is not just that Abraham can't provide something that's supposedly justifiable by public reason, right, in some Rawlsian sense. The problem is that he's about to kill his son, right? That's the problem, that his beliefs are about to take him into an action that the community feels that it must stop. So there are going to be cases where in some sense you can say the exchange of reasons breaks down to the extent that you forcibly restrict somebody from doing something because of the claims that they're making about private revelation from God. That's going to happen potentially within a Christian community, as well as between a Christian community and outsiders to the faith.
Is it working? I wanted to follow up on a comment that Paul just made. And if you consider yourself to be a practical person and you're told that salvation is through the church, then you really can't be told that, well, it's a theoretical church. I was waiting to hear what is its name and what is its address.
Yeah, that's exactly the question I think that that Kierkegaard would push to Hauerwas. Now, for Hauerwas, functionally, he has appealed to the Anabaptist Church or the Mennonite churches in his own work since the early '90s, through John Howard Yoder in various ways, and arguing that that sort of church does exist. And look at the Mennonites. I grew up in a Mennonite church. It's not that. So part of I get it. It's all of our work is biographical in some ways, but I think it's finally coming to light that the Mennonite Church isn't that church either. And Hauerwas has argued that his kind of project depends on there being that church, and this is why I think it's now that this is there is no real church that has done this, and yet people still do learn how to be Christians. How do we narrate that is the question that I think is the question that goes beyond than what Hauerwas is trying to argue here. And this is where there has to be something more than the practice of the church that forms Christians. And I think either that or Christians can accidentally be formed good even through bad churches, which is probably a good theological claim too. But yes, and this is why I think that God does work despite the fact that we screw up a lot. And I think that's where Hauerwas doesn't. He kind of pretends he has an answer to that, but he really doesn't. And that's I think there has to be some. And Kierkegaard has ways of talking about that I think at least push Hauerwas in that direction.
Professor Herdt, thank you. Paul Ricoeur seems to share many of your concerns about this post hoc justification springing from controversies for justifying our own communal practices, and I'm thinking in particular about original sin. He says when we hear that infant in the mother's womb is already guilty, this is not just rational theology, this is entering into the controversies of the schools. And he thinks something has gone seriously wrong in there in the same kind of way that you seem to be suggesting. This is a post hoc justification for communal practice. And he wants to take us back to the symbol as a way of rooting our reason-making and our reason-giving. And I wonder if you could just speak briefly to that. Do you think this is a way of bridging the divide between our communal practices on the one hand and rational justifications to others, but that isn't exhausted in the rational justifications? So he would say, we talk about wandering in the desert and captivity in certain ways within the Jewish Christian tradition, but other people have experiences of captivity as well that can be a ground then for these kinds of inter-religious discussions. What do you think about the symbol?
I haven't spent enough time with Paul Ricoeur to speak specifically to his conception of these things, but what you seem to be gesturing toward here is something that I think certainly is always at work in our attempts to come to understand one another. That is, we reach for common human experiences, and I think the pendulum is shifting somewhat in recent decades away from an emphasis on social formation to some emphasis on common human, some greater willingness to speak about human nature. When I was in graduate school, you got laughed out of the room if you wanted to invoke human nature, and I don't think the atmosphere is the same on that today. I mean, that doesn't mean that I think we're returning to human nature in a radically particularist and historicist way, and I think that's going to be very fruitful.
Just a question for Jennifer here again. So, in a way, you've spoken to giving reasons for the things that we're doing. And if I'm to understand Haidt correctly, when Abraham is asked that question of why are you going to kill your son, Abraham wouldn't say initially what it actually was. He'd go on to provide a rationalization for something that would make sense kind of after that point. And so I almost feel like as a Christian community, our reasons are oblique to ourselves before we even come to the greater public space. And a lot of the reasons we do things are not based on biblical principles. They're based on our culture, our society, and factors that we don't even understand ourselves. How would we begin a project of educating ourselves and the church such that we can come up with intelligible answers that actually speak to the truth of why we're doing what we're doing?
The answer is we make use of every resource that's available to us. That is, so I pointed in this paper to exchanging reasons with outsiders, but we also need to do the very best biblical scholarship we can do. We need to engage in the very best historical scholarship that we can engage in. We need to allow Scripture to critique the church and allow the church to inform our understanding of Scripture, and have all of these things mutually informing of one another. So it's not a glorious, it doesn't point to any one dramatic thing that's a solution. There's many different mutually correcting solutions, and no guarantee that at the end of the day we get out of error.
And maybe just a quick follow-up to that. I wonder if Kierkegaard's project and the Socratic project of reducing our knowledge, reducing us to almost a state of aporia, that we realize what we don't understand, might be a good first step in that.
Thank you. I think that is a potentially important moment. I'm not sure I'd want to elevate it to being universally the first step.
Hi. Just a quick question. I've started reading a book. It's called Emerging Hope by Jimmy Long. And he talks about the generational transition that's happening. And he kind of suggests that my generation, the generation of millennials, will just kind of be lost because you have the older generations who are stuck in the traditional, we're not going to change. And then there are just a few people who are like, grasping and searching for things, but nobody's giving them the right answers that they want. So you mentioned the particular to universal. How do you think Kierkegaard would say, like, address the traditional generations and the upcoming generations and the kind of lost generation that's in between?
Thanks, that's a great question. I mean, inevitably, every generation that's gone past one generation thinks the subsequent generation is lost. So that's just part of growing up, I guess. What I would say, what I think Kierkegaard would say is, look, that's the point. Christianity needs to be relearned every generation. We can never live the generation, the Christianity of a different generation. We can never live the Christianity of someone else. And his point is, every generation needs to learn Christianity again, because it's something that has to be lived in a way that, yeah, it might sound anti-traditional and sort of, and you can see how Hauerwas reacts to that sort of thing. But in a sense, every life is different, and you can. And Kierkegaard's going to say that's there's no easy way in which that can be narrated. There's no guarantees, and that's why you live it.
I think Hauerwas, in some sense, sees himself as responding to this situation by way of the emphasis on formation. That we have a generation that's not formed in Christian practices, and he thinks the route in is not through doctrine. The route in is through practices, which then make intelligible the doctrines that go along with them. Now, that we're always trying to identify the sense in which the church is always new every generation is we're always trying to identify what is the crisis of this moment, what is the thing that most needs correction here and now, and what we say is going to depend on what we understand as the crisis here.
Thanks for your awesome presentations. I don't have a Kierkegaard question, but I do have a question about, and I'll try and pose this so both of you could answer. Professor Herdt, I couldn't help but feel as if your response sounded similar, or at least it reminded me of Stout's critique in Democracy and Tradition about the tendency for Hauerwas's church world distinction to sort of pull back on the notion of reason giving as an opportunity for interaction. And that sort of goes along with his critique of democracy. And Dr. Martens, I think you criticized the location of ecclesiology as an overemphasis on the soteriological moment, that in some sense we act as if we are being what we already are. And this forfeits a kind of responsibility. I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about where to locate, given that those options are sort of problematic, where to locate our agreements on what counts as a good or bad reason in these particular moments. Where do we locate that responsibility? I think Hauerwas can locate it in a kind of lordship of Christ. In some sense, we're doing what we already are. I don't think Stout would locate it in a form of Christianity. So I guess I wonder if that kind of closed off ecclesiocentrism is a problem, and I think it might be. Where do we locate, or how do we locate the agreements that we share as a way of judging our reason giving in these particular scenarios? And I think maybe this is a question about how do we relate Christian virtues to other virtues.
All right, Brandon, good question. I'll start, and Jennifer will correct me. What I'd say is this. I think the claim that Jesus is Lord, the way Hauerwas uses it, is too narrow. And at one level, it's not humble enough, and another level, it's too strong. What I would say, and how I'd begin to talk about this, and there's no easy answer to this. What I begin to say is, look, if Jesus is Lord of all things. That's what that claim means, not just of the church, and Lord of all creation. And therefore, I would say, in that sense, then all creation is responsible to Christ, if that's what the claim you want to make. And so, in that sense, the responsibility, both in the church and out of the church, is to Christ in a certain way. Now, they would have, at some level, I mean, inside the church, outside of the church, there's different languages that will be expressed in this way. But I think what Hauerwas gives up, or has an account of, sort of an insufficient account of, if you really think that God is, if things are created, if the world is, Word made flesh, if the world is created in this way, then you have to believe that there are ways in which we can communicate. If we're all created in God's image, etc. As one way to start that conversation, that says, yeah, at some level there is a common ground here. It's not all the way through, but to presume that people outside of the church can't make sense of this sort of claim or anything like it, I think is both too humble and too arrogant at the same time. At least that's where I'd start.
I have nothing to correct. I agree with that 100%. I think, and I think actually Hauerwas would try to agree with it as well. I think, though, that he's just wary of making any general claims about this. He's willing. He's shown in his recent work. He's very willing to engage in conversation and find particular points of common ground and particular moments of common understanding and so on. But he doesn't want to make any general claims about their significance. So that's where I think you and I would be in the same boat in terms of thinking that the fact that this is God's good, if fallen, and in process of being redeemed creation should make us willing to stick our necks out a little bit farther on that score, always knowing that, possibly whatever claim we make about what nature is or what God's claim on humanity is, it could be wrong and could stand in need of its own correction. But that's not a reason not to open our mouths and make such claims.
All right, it's time now for a break and to be followed by various colloquium presentations. So we thank very much our two presenters this afternoon.